Well, welcome. I'm Jim Sturba from the Philosophy Department. This is the second of two conferences on contemporary moral theory and the problem of evil. The first conference was held this past November. Both conferences have been generously funded by the John Templeton Foundation and supported by the Philosophy Department, for which we're very grateful. Now, we almost didn't have this second conference. Back in November, the first conference with Marilyn Adams, Stephen Weistra, and Linda Zadnepsky was going so well. Their arguments for solving the problem of evil were developing so convincingly. Their papers were building on each other so nicely that it seemed a foregone conclusion that we would soon have a fully defensible solution to the problem of evil, and thus there would be no need at all for this second conference. I didn't know what I was going to do. Call off the second conference, give the money back to Templeton. But it was just then that our audience, your counterpart, started to play a crucial role, raising one insightful question after another. Then it became clear that despite the illuminating papers, the first conference speakers had not yet finished working out a defensible solution to the problem of evil, and more work had yet to be done. So there really is a need for this second conference to complete the work of the first. We still do not have a fully worked out solution to the problem of evil. Now, in recent years, discussion of the problem of evil has been advanced by utilizing resources of contemporary metaphysics and epistemology, for example, Alvin Plantinga's application of modal logic to the logical problem of evil, and William Rowe and Stephen Weistra's application of probabilistic epistemology to the evidential problem of evil. The results have been impressive. What is a bit surprising, however, is that philosophers are currently working on the problem of evil have yet to avail themselves of relevant resources from contemporary moral theory that could similarly advance the discussion of the problem. For example, there's no discussion of the doctrine of double effect, or whether the ends justify the means, or how to solve hypothetical trolley cases that have become the grists for moral philosophers ever since they were introduced by Judith Thomson and Philippa Foot. Even though contemporary cognitive psychologists now regularly employ hypothetical trolley cases to determine what parts of the brain are involved in the making of moral judgments, contemporary philosophers of religion have yet to recognize the relevance of such cases to the problem of evil. What is particularly surprising, given that most of the defenders of theism in this debate are self-identified Christian philosophers, is that the central underlying element in the doctrine of double effect, what has been called the Pauline principle, never do evil that good may come of it, has been virtually ignored by contemporary philosophers of religion, despite its relevance to the problem of evil. Thus, while the principle has been a mainstay of religious ethics, at least since the time of Aquinas, notice, for example, the fundamental role it plays in the natural ethics of our own John Finnis, contemporary philosophers of religion have simply ignored it when evaluating the goods and evils that are at stake with regard to the argument from evil. Rather, they have focused on the total amount of good or evil in the world, or on particular horrendous evils, or whether those evils can be compensated for. There is also an intertwining discussion of trolley cases with the Pauline principle, which underlies the doctrine of double effect in contemporary moral theory that is ignored by contemporary philosophers of religion when they seek to morally evaluate the problem of evil. Now, today, no one working on the problem of evil has ever imagined backing away from the advances that Alvin Plantinga made by applying modal logic to the logical problem of evil, or to the advances that William Rowe and Stephen Weistra made by applying probabilistic epistemology to the evidential problem of evil. All now agree that our understanding of the problem of evil has been undeniably improved by these advances. Could it be then that by bringing to bear the untapped resources of contemporary moral theory on the problem of evil, there would be a similar advance in our understanding of the problem? At some point in their discussion of the topic of our conference, our speakers were asked to address the thesis that there are yet untapped resources in contemporary moral theory for effecting a more adequate solution to the problem of evil. Speakers could either agree with the thesis and seek to develop it, or they could disagree with it in whole or part and argue against it. I'm happy to report that they all complied, or at least I think they all have complied. I still have to see a relevant portion of one of the speaker's papers to 5 minutes ago. 5 minutes ago. 10. Now, after each paper has been presented, I will take a couple of minutes to indicate how I see the paper relating to the Templeton Project before we open the floor to questions. So I now give you my colleague, Karl Ameriks, who will introduce our first speaker.
I'll be brief. It's a great pleasure to have John Hare here again. Many of you, I hope, recollect his earlier visits here. He's been a distinguished visitor before. And it's great to have him on this particular topic. Also, since we're moving from the first to the second conference, I just want to reinforce what Jim said. Those who weren't here at the first conference missed something. It really was a spectacular, great set of papers, and it's great to have John Hare leading off the second one. Yeah, okay, which, under your name or? Okay, yeah, so I've been to a lot of Notre Dame conferences. The three papers there, including Steve's, were really, a trio that's quite special. So I recommend that you all look at it. Now for today, it turns out that if you have the handout, you'll see that the topic is Kant, Job, and the problem of evil. And we happen to have an expert in Professor John Hare, who I can certify is, one of the top people in the world on Kant. He has a excellent knowledge also of the Bible and Job, and I think he knows a lot about evil. I've read a number of his books on the topic, and I'll recommend them to you. Let me just read from the back of one of my favorite books, God and Morality, John E. Hare, Philosophical History. It says, John E. Hare is Noah Porter Professor of Philosophical Theology. I'll come back to that at Yale University. His books include The Moral Gap, 1996. This is a very substantive book. Might as well start there. God's Call, much shorter but also excellent, 2001. And Why Bother Being Good, 2002. One general comment about those is that they're extraordinary in that in these books, you'll find the problem of evil and general moral problems approached from four different perspectives that very few people can talk about all at once, namely knowledge of ancient ethics, medieval philosophy, modern philosophy, including Kant, and then contemporary theory. That's quite unusual to see that, and I think it's very important. It makes the works very good. Then the blurb goes on. He has also written on Greek philosophy, international relations, Kant, evolutionary ethics, and biomedical ethics. So there are a lot of hesitate to say applied ethics, but a lot of concrete issues that John has also written on, he's very good on. And his position as Noah Porter Professor of Philosophical Theology is really a very distinguished position. You have to actually know theology and be capable in the Divinity School. And he also works in the philosophy department where he's a first-rate philosopher. So this is a very unusual combination. I'm glad he's the Noah Porter professor. There are many people named Noah Porter. The most famous was, I think, the mid-19th century philosophical theologian, really, who was also involved in concrete issues in the anti-slavery movement, then probably read Kant and Job, and taught courses at Yale, and became president of the university later. What I like about him is that if you study at that university, there is the Noah Porter Gate in the middle of the university. And all those who, unlike Mr. Cheney, complete their studies, go through that gate at commencement, follow the president, and then begin their scholarly life. And I think everybody should go through the gate of reading the works of the Noah Porter professor. John Hare's works when they study Kant and these issues. So I give you John Hare.
Thank you very much. You did.
It's a very good one.
Yeah. It's a delight to be here. My purpose in this paper is to look at what Kant says about the problem of evil in his brief work on the miscarriage of all philosophical trials in theodicy. This work is a reflection on the story of Job. It's not well known in the contemporary discussion of the problem of evil, and I'm therefore going to describe it in detail. But it fits well in the context of the present conference because what Kant does is to use the tools of his moral theology in order to shed light on what kind of theodicy we should look for and what kind we should not look for. Since the idea behind this conference, as I understand it, is that we ought to be looking at the sophisticated tools of moral philosophy in order to see whether we can make progress in thinking about the problem of evil, it is surely a good idea to look at the tools given us by one of modernity's greatest practitioners of moral philosophy. In this brief work, Kant shows us how to start doing a Kantian reflection of this kind. He is locating the proper limits of theodicy within his overall systematic epistemology, and this is notoriously disputed territory. I will try, nonetheless, to make sense of this embedding, and I will make some suggestions at the end about how the project might be carried further, even by someone not committed to Kant's system as a whole. The work has a structure rather similar to the first critique. In the preface to the second edition of that work, he says, "I have found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith." There then follow 800 dense pages, showing us the limits of human knowledge, which only extends, simplifying somewhat, as far as the possibility of human sense experience. Students who take courses on the first critique are familiar with the pattern by which it takes so long to get through this negative agenda that there is no time left at the end of the semester for discussing what Kant sees as the fruits of all this hard work, namely the faith, the Glaube, for which room has now been made. It's not until we get to the canon of pure reason that we get the positive doctrine, the freedom of the will, the immortality of the soul, and the existence of God. And we're told, if then these three cardinal propositions are not at all necessary for our knowing, and yet are insistently recommended to us by our reason, their importance must really concern only the practical. Kant goes on to tell us that reason in its practical employment requires us to believe that we are, using Leibniz's term, in the realm of grace, where every happiness awaits us as long as we do not ourselves limit our share of it through the unworthiness to be happy. It's not my purpose in the present paper to examine the merits of this claim. I've done so a number of times elsewhere. But I want to point out the similarity of the structure of miscarriage. The work proceeds through an elaborate critique of 9 different forms of philosophical theodicy. It ends with the affirmation, drawn from reflecting on God's words to Job out of the whirlwind, that, and here is the first quote on your handout, on the whole, Kant is indigestible when heard, so I've written out the longer texts for you on the sheet. So number 1, God thereby demonstrates an order and a maintenance of the whole which proclaim a wise creator, even though his ways, inscrutable to us, must at the same time remain hidden. Indeed, already in the physical order of things, and how much more in connection of the latter with the moral order, which is all the more impenetrable to our reason. At the beginning of the concluding remark at the end of the work, he comments, number 2, on your sheet, theodicy, as has been shown here, does not have as much to do with a task in the interest of science, Wissenschaft, from wissen, to know, as rather with a matter of faith, eine Glaubenssache. In other words, we have the same contrast as in the preface to the first critique between knowledge and faith, saying that acknowledging failure in the sphere of the first leads to success in the sphere of the second. Moreover, the term Glaubenssache may pick up the opening of the work, in which Kant says that theodicy is the defending of God's cause, die Sache Gottes. He goes on immediately there to concede that this defending or championing of God's cause might be, at bottom, no more than that of our presumptuous reason failing to recognize its limitations. In other words, there are two kinds of project that are being compared, the first unfavorably with the second. The first kind is a philosophical theodicy, attempting to provide a justification of the ways of God to human beings within the sphere of knowledge. This turns out to be no more than self-deceptive illusion. In the first critique, it's what he calls subreption. The second kind is within the sphere of faith and starts from an acknowledgement of our ignorance. I will try to fill this contrast out in more detail at the end of this paper. There's another structural parallel that is illuminating between the first paragraph of miscarriage and the first sentence of religion within the boundaries of mere reason. This is number 3. So far as morality is based on the conception of the human being as one who is free, but who also, just because of that, binds himself through his reason to unconditional laws, it is in need neither of the idea of another being above him, in order that he recognize his duty, nor that he observe it of an incentive other than the law itself. In both cases, both in religion and in miscarriage, it's easy to get the impression that the project of the work is entirely destructive from a theological point of view. In religion, Kant looks as though he's saying that if we are free, and therefore bind ourselves to the moral law, we don't need the idea of God or an incentive other than the law itself, such as God's rewarding of virtue. It's easy to think that he means us to detach the consequent. For we are free, and we do bind ourselves to the law, and so it would seem we don't need the idea of God. But at the beginning of the third paragraph of religion, Kant says that morality inevitably leads to religion. How can this be? The answer is that he thinks that we human beings are not merely free, not merely rational, but also creatures of sense and creatures of need. And we desire our happiness in everything else we desire. Again, I'm not going to discuss the details of this argument because I've done so elsewhere, and I want to focus on the problem of evil. But on my view, Kant wants to make the point that it is rationally unstable for human beings, being the combination they are, to attempt to lead a morally good life without believing in God, as the supersensible author of nature. So also, at the beginning of miscarriage, Kant looks as though he's going to deny the validity of theodicy, period. He says that the would-be advocate of God has to prove one of 3 things. Either, this is number 4 on your sheet, either there's nothing counter-purposive, zweckwiedrig, in the world, or 2, if there is any such thing, it's not an intended effect, but the unavoidable consequence of the nature of things. Or 3, it's the intended effect not of God, but merely of rational beings, for example, humans or angels. He's going on to show that none of these 3 proofs work. He also here foreshadows Jim Sturber's suggestion that we might try using the doctrine of double effect for theodical purposes. But characteristically, his conclusion is not that there is no theodicy, but that there is no proof. or there's no theodicy proper, which would be the result of a philosophical trial. Yet he says, this is number 5, we cannot deny the name theodicy to the mere dismissal of all charges against divine wisdom, if this is a pronouncement of the same reason through which we form our concept of God, necessarily and prior to all experience, as a moral and wise being. As in religion and in the first critique, this reason through which we form our concept of God as moral sovereign of the world is reason in its practical rather than its speculative employment. I want to go on now to the negative or destructive parts of Kant's project in this work. But I don't want to end up by only doing that. He starts by disallowing a strategy that might at first sight seem identical to the strategy he eventually adopts himself. We may not, he says, dismiss the complaints of reason about counter-purposiveness simply through a decree of incompetency of the tribunal of human reason, by saying that God is supremely wise and therefore all doubts must be dismissed as groundless. Kant uses a legal analogy here. We're not allowed to claim exceptio fori, an exception to the court. In other words, we're not allowed to claim that the court is not competent to conduct the trial. King Charles I of England and Scotland made a claim of this kind against Parliament at the beginning of the trial at which he was condemned to death. What's the difference between the claim Kant is rejecting here and the claim he ends up accepting about the limits of human reason? I think the key is that the claim he's rejecting would immediately explain away as groundless, even without examination, all doubts that might be raised against it. It's one of Kant's conditions for sincerity, which he's going to praise in Job as a paradigm, that before we submit ourselves to the feeling of respect, Achtung, we test all claims against the doctrine that proposes to us that we should respect it. We're not allowed, as it were, to finesse the need for this examination by simply declaring from the outset that no such claim is allowed. Kant then proceeds to the examination of the claims of whatever is counterpurposive in the world against the wisdom of the world's creator. He says that there are 3 kinds, and this is number 6. First, there is the absolutely counterpurposive, or what cannot be condoned or desired either as end or means. This, he says, is the morally counterpurposive, or evil proper. We might say sin. The second is the conditionally counterpurposive, or what can indeed never coexist with the wisdom of a will as end, yet can do so as means. This is the physically counterpurposive, or what he calls ill or pain. The third is counterpurposiveness in the proportion of ill to evil. Kant is notoriously a retributivist. He thinks that justice requires that there be a strict proportioning of penalty and crime, and so that a just world run by a divine moral wisdom would have to be a world in which everyone gets his due. The attributes of the world sovereign against whom the charges are being made can be specified in terms of these 3 kinds of counterpurposiveness. The 3 roles of the sovereign are like the 3 roles of human sovereigns, namely, the role of legislator, making the laws, the role of executive, running the world in accordance with the law, and the role of judge, judging our compliance with the law. The connection with the 3 kinds of counterpurposiveness is that the divine lawgiver has to be holy, in opposition to the moral evil in the world. The divine executive has to be benevolent, in contrast with the countless ills and pains of the rational beings of the world. And the divine judge has to be just, in comparison to the bad state which the disproportion between the impunity of the depraved and their crimes seems to indicate in the world. In each case, there is something we find in the world which presents a prima facie objection against one of the three attributes. Why would a holy God allow moral evil? Why would a benevolent God allow pain? Why would a just God allow impunity of the unrighteous? Kant then proceeds to lay out three philosophical attempts to rebut each of these three charges. There's a certain formal elegance to this. He's going to say that all 9 of them fail. This is the destructive part of the project. He allows that there may be in time other attempts, but he thinks he's collected the main ones, current up to his day. I will call the 3 charges the objection from holiness, the objection from benevolence, and the objection from justice. In each case, the 3 theological responses to each charge are sequential, making a claim in the first response, then withdrawing to the position that even if that first claim fails, there's a second one, and then withdrawing even further, even if the second fails, there's a third. The first charge is that there is an inconsistency between a holy God and the moral evil in the world. And the first attempt at rebutting this charge is to deny that there is any moral evil understood as contravention of God's law. Moral wisdom, according to this attempt, is human wisdom, not divine. Kant explains this further by saying, "The ways of the Most High are not our ways. Those on high have their own laws," he says, quoting. And he's actually probably here making a reference to Isaiah 55, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Kant is contemptuous of this reply. Surely it can be freely given, he says, freely given over to the detestation of every human being who has the least feeling for morality. He does not object to saying that God's wisdom is incommensurable with our own. In discussing Job's encounter with God in the whirlwind, Kant says of the wise creator, even though his ways inscrutable to us, must at the same time remain hidden. But what he dislikes in this first response is that it denies that God is a moral legislator. Throughout his corpus, Kant insists that we have to recognize our duties as God's commands. Actually, Kant ties God's holiness more intimately to the moral law than he needs to do just for the purpose of rejecting the first response. We could hold, unlike Kant, that the moral law withers away in the next life, where we enter into the love that is between the persons of the Trinity. We could still hold that in this life we have to regard our duties as God's commands. We would then not be able to escape the first objection legitimately by saying that God is not, after all, opposed to the evil that we do. The second response to the objection from holiness is that even if there is moral evil, it is not to be held against God because it is a necessary consequence of our finitude. God cannot create finite beings like us without allowing this evil. Kant thinks that this response is incoherent. If the evil that we do is simply the result of our finitude, we're not to be blamed for it. But if we are not to be blamed for it, it's not really moral evil. Kant is consistent in holding that moral evil is imputable to us. For example, he says about the subjective ground of our action, but this subjective ground must in turn always itself be a deed of freedom. For otherwise, the use or abuse of the human being's power of choice with respect to the moral law could not be imputed to him, nor could the good or evil in him be called moral. This second response is unacceptable because it denies our freedom. There's more to say here, but since Kant ends up collapsing the third response into the second, I will postpone further discussion till the third response has been described. The third response to the objection from holiness is that even if there is moral evil, and even if it is a guilt resting on the human being, no guilt may be ascribed to God, for, this is number 7, I quote, "For God has merely tolerated it for just causes as a deed of human beings. In no way has he condoned it, willed, or promoted it." The idea of this response is that we are to be held accountable for this evil, and God is not. God simply tolerates it for just causes. One odd feature of Kant's treatment here is that he does not specify or give examples of what kind of just cause might lead God to tolerate this guilt of ours. The obvious example might seem to be human freedom and the kind of free will defense that Augustine mounts in De Libero Arbitrio. But it is surely significant here that Kant is formed as a Lutheran. He is a compatibilist about human freedom, though a compatibilist of a rather odd kind. Most compatibilists are reductive, reducing our freedom to our desires and beliefs ordered in a certain way. Kant wants to insist that our will is free to choose what is right, whatever we desire. But he also holds that our freedom is compatible with our actions being the effect of God's will, even though we do not understand how this combination is possible. In the present work, he puts this point as follows. This is number 7, at the end of number 7. It might be over the page, I'm not sure. For to be a creature, and as a natural being merely the result of the will of the Creator, yet to be capable of responsibility as a freely acting being, one which has a will independent of external influence and possibly opposed to the latter in a variety of ways, but again to consider one's own deed at the same time also as the effect of a higher being, this is a combination of concepts which we must indeed think together in the idea of a world and of a highest good, but which can be intuited only by one who penetrates to the cognition of the supersensible or intelligible world and sees the manner in which this grounds the sensible world. We humans do not have the kind of intuition required for this penetration, and only God has it. The kind of free will defense mounted by, for example, Alvin Plantinga is not going to be appealing to a compatibilist of this kind. If our actions are also the effect of a higher being, we cannot acquit God from moral evil on the grounds that the evil is our deed and God does not condone or will or promote it. We could only acquit God if the limitations of what we are essentially make it necessary for God to tolerate what we do in order to achieve some just cause. Again, Kant does not specify what this is, but we might speculate with Calvin that it is God's glory. And I have some quotes from Kant to that effect. But then we're left in the same situation as with the second response. On this view, we cannot be held responsible because we've lost our freedom, but this is unacceptable. I can be briefer about the objection from benevolence. Again, there are 3 theodical responses. The first starts from the premise that everyone would rather live than be dead. Does not this mean that however bad our life becomes, we still think there's more good in it than ill? Even suicides, so goes the response, agree with this to the extent that they postpone their self-killing. And when they carry it out, they're no longer there to count as a counterexample. Kant objects to this response, that it seriously underestimates the amount of our suffering. Every human being of sound mind who has thought long and hard about the value of life, he says, would decline to play the game of life once more. If you were offered the chance to do it all over again, you'd say no. This is not just true if he's offered a repetition of his own circumstances, but even any other circumstances he chooses, provided they are not of a fairy world, but of this earthly world of ours. The second response is to concede that our lives contain more pain than pleasure, but to say that this is inevitable given our nature as animals. Kant objects that there's no necessity for God to create us at all. If it's true that our lives are inevitably miserable as a whole, surely benevolence would have refrained from creating us at all. The third response is the most interesting. It's a variant of the soul-making theodicy often associated with John Hick. God has put us here, the response goes, for the sake of a future happiness. We are to become worthy of that future glory precisely through our struggle with adversities. Kant's objection is that even though it's possible that God could not have prepared us for the next life without putting us through the kind of trial to which most succumb, and the kind of life that is unhappy even for the best of us, we've no reason from our experience or understanding to think that this is true. The point about most people succumbing is an important one. Soul-making theodicies point to second-order goods, like bravery and compassion, that are produced out of our misery, and which require the misery for their production. But there are also second-order evils, like depression and cynicism and withdrawal, and these also are produced out of our misery. If the second-order goods are great enough to justify the misery, should it not follow that the second-order evils are great enough to de-justify it? And if Kant is right that most people succumb, then the de-justification will outweigh the justification. Kant admits that we can cut the Gordian knot at this point. Alexander the Great, according to the story, was faced with a large knot in a rope and solved the problem by cutting through it with his sword. In the same way, we can simply appeal to God's wisdom here and say that since God is benevolent, we should accept this possibility that all these trials must be necessary as the truth. But this is not, he says, a philosophical theodicy, which needs to give a reason and not simply to appeal to faith. Kant spends most time on the objection from justice. The first response to the apparent injustice of the world is to appeal to the human conscience and say that the evils we do are justly punished by the torments of bad conscience. Kant does, in fact, as we know from elsewhere, believe that even the most hardened criminal retains the predisposition to the good that responds to the moral law. But in the present passage, he objects that the depraved person, even if he still hears the voice of conscience, is not much bothered by it. And if only he can escape the external floggings for his heinous deeds, laughs at the scrupulousness of the honest who inwardly plague themselves with self-inflicted rebuke. The second response to the objection from justice is reminiscent of the third response to the objection from benevolence. It concedes that we see apparent injustice in the world and the wicked seem to prosper, but the response is that this apparent injustice is itself meant to produce virtue. And the final result is, Kant says, a glorious moral melody. In other words, the suffering produces the virtue. Kant's reply is this might be acceptable if we could see this result. But in fact what we see is that the suffering is not so that his virtue should be pure, but because it was pure. Again, we could postulate a future life in which virtue and happiness go together, and we know that Kant does in fact say that immortality is one of the postulates of practical reason. But again, this would not be a philosophical theodicy, which is an exercise of speculative reason within knowledge. This appeal to a future life is taken up in the final response. Suppose we concede that there is not a glorious moral melody as far as we can tell in this life. May we not appeal to the next life? And here the answer again depends on the nature of theodicy. As I quoted earlier, Kant thinks that a theodicy proper belongs in the domain of theoretical reason, and there are no grounds within this domain for a belief in a second life that would rectify the injustice of this life. Indeed, it would be rational to conclude, he says, based on our knowledge of this world, that another life would be very likely under the same laws as this one, and thus the agreement of human fate with the divine justice is just as little to be expected there as here. This ends the destructive portion of the text. We're now ready, after two intervening distinctions, to apply what we've learned to the story of Job. The two intervening distinctions are between two kinds of wisdom, artistic and moral, and two kinds of theodicy, doctrinal and authentic. Artistic wisdom is the wisdom in the running of the cosmos that we can determine within the limits of our knowledge, namely a mutual proportioning of means and ends. Kant is in fact optimistic about the prospects of a physico-teleological argument for the existence of a highest architect of the world, although he does not think we can prove within the theoretical use of reason the existence of a creator of the world who would be an all-sufficient original being. Moral wisdom is the wisdom that governs the cosmos under moral law. Unfortunately, we have no concept within the limits of the human understanding of how, in the sensible world, these two wisdoms are unified. We have no insight into how the supersensible or intelligible world grounds the sensible world. The best we can reach is a negative wisdom of our own, which tells us that we do not know that there is no such unity and no such grounding. This negative wisdom is important because if we did know that there was no such unity and no such grounding, we could not legitimately believe in such postulates. Kant's going to argue, as he does in all three critiques, that in the absence of such a veto from theoretical reason, we may, and indeed we must, believe in this unity with our practical reason. The distinction between the two kinds of theodicy is that doctrinal theodicy is a philosophical inference within speculative reason from the utterances of the legislator. That's a slightly odd phrase, here understood as God's created world, since God creates by speaking. By contrast, an authentic theodicy is made by the legislator himself, not by our inference. Kant understands the dismissal of objections against the divine wisdom as a divine decree, and so as issuing from God himself. His reasoning can be spelled out as follows. He thinks this dismissal is a pronouncement of the same reason by which we form our notion of God as a moral and wise being. This reason is reason in its practical and not in its speculative employment. The reason, when it legislates, commands absolutely. It gives us a categorical imperative. And it can also be considered as the voice of God, through which he gives meaning to the letter of his creation. To put this in another way, the idea is that morality itself both gives us a demand for how we are to live and gives us an interpretation of the world in which that demand is to be carried out, namely, that this world is run by a being who has the purpose of the highest good, the end that morality itself gives to us. Kant says that he finds this authentic theodicy expressed allegorically in the story of Job. Job was, so the Bible tells us, this is Kant's list, healthy, well-to-do, free, master over others whom he can make happy, surrounded by a happy family, among beloved friends, and on top of all this, what is most important, says Kant, at peace with himself in a good conscience. This list of goods is revealing of Kant's own priorities. Making others happy and making oneself morally good are themselves what he calls elsewhere the matter of morality. And then all these goods, except for the crucial last one, are snatched from Job. And he also has to suffer the consolation of his friends. Kant's main purpose here is to distinguish the theodicies implicit in the supposed comfort given by Job's friends and in Job himself. as he's addressed by the voice from the whirlwind. The friends declare that Job's ills come from God's justice as so many punishments for crimes committed. They cannot actually point to any such crimes, but they claim to know a priori that there must be some, for otherwise it would be impossible for God to punish Job in this way. Job protests his innocence, though he admits that he's a fragile creature, liable to error, as all humans are. He says that he does not understand why God has done this, but that it is an unconditional divine decision. And, I quote, he has decided he does as he wills. Kant contrasts the spirit of the two sides in this dispute. The friends speak as if they thought they could ingratiate themselves with God by their piety, or as if gaining God's favor were more important to them than the truth. They assert things where they have no insight, and pretend to a certainty that they cannot actually have. Job rebukes them for secretly having consideration for persons, as though God could be flattered into favor in this way, and for hypocrisy. He himself is frank about his lack of understanding, and he prays to God not to hide his face. Even so, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. And then God does reveal himself, and deigns to lay before Job's eyes, in Kant's words, the wisdom of his creation, especially its inscrutability. Strikingly, God reveals not just glimpses of the beautiful side of creation, but Kant stresses this, also harmful and fearful things, fearsome things. One thinks of Otto and the mysterium, which is fascinans but also tremendum. God shows Job things that appear to be purposive for their own sake, but counter-purposive to other things, including human beings, and appear to be incompatible with a universal plan established with goodness and wisdom. Kant doesn't indicate which fearsome things he has in mind, but he is surely referring to the descriptions of Behemoth and Leviathan in Job 40 and 41. What God reveals is something double, both an order and maintenance of the whole, and an inscrutability or impenetrability to our reason. This combination is a theme that appears elsewhere in Kant. God is concerned, he supposes, to preserve our freedom. It may be providential that we cannot see God or prove God's existence within speculative reason. For, I quote, God and eternity with their awful majesty would stand unceasingly before our eyes, and we would end up conforming to the moral law from hope or fear and not from duty. It would be like, Kant says, a puppet show, in which everything would gesticulate well, but there would be no life in the figures. It's better that practical reason give us our first view into the realm of the supersensible, though only, Kant says, with weak glances. Job responds to the revelation from the whirlwind by conceding that he had spoken about things that were too high for him, that he did not understand, even though, as Kant points out, he did much better in this respect than his friends. In the final comparison, Job's friends might seem more pious, and Kant sarcastically notes that most ecclesiastical bodies in his time would applaud them. But Job himself is the truly faithful one. He did not found his morality on faith, I quote, this is number 11 on your sheet, but his faith on morality. There's an echo here of the very end of religion, where Kant says, the right way to advance is not from grace to virtue, but rather from virtue to grace. He's holding up for our admiration a religion of good life, conduct. And his polemic is against people who think they can move from what they know about God independently of their moral commitment in other words, in the theoretical use of reason, to a conclusion about what God requires of them. The end of the work is a concluding remark about sincerity. This is full of interest, especially if we're looking for an account of Kant's view of conscience. But it's not directly related to our present purpose of describing Kant's view of the proper limits of theodicy. So I want to end this paper by talking about what we could keep from Kant's account, even if we did not accept his overall systematic epistemology. I will have to be rather dogmatic, since I do not have space to justify many of the assumptions that I'm making here. Many of Kant's successors could not accept the view that we experience a world of phenomena grounded somehow in a world of noumena, of things in themselves. Kant himself thought that this view was required by reason, but I propose that we think of it instead as a translation of a metaphysical picture Kant inherited from Christianity and the various attempts in Christian history to achieve a synthesis with the various metaphysical pictures of Greek antiquity. We find this idea of a translation in Kant's religion, where he proposes to think of revelation as two concentric circles, with the outer area of the larger circle representing historical revelation, the revelation to particular people at particular times and places, and the inside circle representing the revelation to reason, supposedly to all people at all times and places. In religion, Kant proposes to translate the central moments of Christian doctrine from the outside circle into the language of the inside circle using the moral concepts. But suppose there is no universal revelation to reason. There could still be translation into the language of morality. I propose that we think of Kant's metaphysics in the same way, not supposing that there is some reason neutral between Christian theism and its various alternatives, but translating the biblical faith into language about what we can know. If we start in this way with a creator God, transcendent to creation, we will almost inevitably end up with some form of noumenal phenomenal distinction, at least with respect to our knowledge of God. That is, we will have to distinguish between Deus in se and Deus pro nobis. We will also have to form some view about the relation of this God to morality. Kant himself, at least in the second critique, gives up the attempt to justify the claim of the moral law upon us and proposes instead to simply start from the fact of reason, that we are under the moral law. Someone who accepts a divine command theory may think we should say that we are under the moral law because God commands this. But in either case, the position is that God gives us the moral law and also runs the universe so that it makes sense for us to try to live by it. Kant, I want to concede, tries to establish too close a relation between God and morality. In his account of the next life, he presents it as one in which we progress towards, though we never reach, holiness. And his conception of holiness is the complete conformity of dispositions with the moral law. I think we should say rather that most of what we know as the moral law will wither away. There will no longer be a context for prohibitions on lying or adultery or murder, and so on. Our relation to God there, and I think here in embryo, is one of union through knowledge and love, entering into the love that is between the persons of the Trinity. Condiligentes, as Scotus says. Co-lovers. Kant is wary of the kind of enthusiasm or fanaticism that he thinks is generated by this kind of mystical language. Even if we disagree with him about this, however, we may still want to say that God gives us the moral law by command. This is all we need for what I will call somewhat pretentiously a transcendental response to the problem of evil. This is the contribution of this paper, if it makes one, is this transcendental response to the problem of evil, which respects the sort of limits on our knowledge that Kant describes, at least with respect to our knowledge of God. The central idea is that if we accept that we are under the moral law and that God gives us this law, then we have to believe also that the creation is the kind of place in which the attempt to live by the moral law makes sense. I already introduced what Kant calls the moral concept of God, which derives from God's holiness as lawgiver, God's benevolence as ruler or preserver, and God's justice as judge. There's the beginning of an argument here, but I won't go into it, that these three sovereign roles have to be played by a single being. For human sovereigns, they do not have to be. All that's necessary is that the same law that is being legislated, that is the template for administration, and that it's also the standard for judgment. But if we grant that it's the same being, this picture gives us something to say about the evil in the world in the broad sense of evil in which it encompasses what Kant calls ill in addition to evil proper. We will not get a theodicy in the sense of giving God's reason for allowing some particular ill, such as Job's. That would extend beyond the proper limits of our knowledge, even if we're more modest in articulating these limits than Kant himself was. The distinction between God in God's self and God in relation to us allows us to say that we do not have insight into God's own mind, except to the extent God reveals that to us, even if we're more generous than Kant about the possibilities of individuals receiving special revelation. But we will get a framework for thinking about the limits of the evil in the broad sense that God allows. We can make another distinction following the scholastics between God's antecedent and God's consequent will. The consequent disposing will, Occam says, is that by which God wills efficaciously in positing something in being, but in antecedently willing from eternity that a given created will should act in a certain way, God does not determine the created will to act in that way. When Adam ate the apple, he was frustrating God's antecedent permissive will, even though he was fulfilling God's consequent permissive will. We might say then that evil in the narrow sense, or sin, is never permitted by God with the antecedent will, whereas ill can sometimes be so permitted. And we can then ask, are there any limits on how much ill is permitted by this antecedent will? The transcendental response to the problem of evil proposes that there are limits produced by the requirement that the moral life makes sense in the creation as it is established and maintained by the divine sovereign. What these limits might be can be illuminated by a couple of thought experiments. Suppose the gods set us up, as the Epicureans believed, for their own entertainment, rather as we now watch the soaps on television. Perhaps they gave us a moral sense because that made our subsequent agonizing more entertaining. Or suppose there is an evil demon, rather like the one Descartes imagines in the Meditations, except that this demon is interested in mucking up our moral lives instead of our cognitive lives. This demon brings it about that when we try to do good, we actually produce harm roughly 3/4 of the time. The purpose of these thought experiments is to introduce the thought that if we accept from Kant the principle that ought implies can, we are committed to believing in two kinds of limit to evil in the broad sense. We have to be able to will what is morally good, and we have to be able to accomplish it reasonably often. These are limits on evil because the human heart cannot be so corrupt that it is incapable, given the divine and human systems available, incapable of what Kant calls a revolution. And the world cannot be so mired in evil that we cannot actually produce good even if we will it. These two limits on evil come from God's legislative and executive roles. But finally, and I think less securely, there's a third kind of limit that results from picturing God's role as judge. Perhaps Kant's retributivism is too strict here when he claims that we have to believe in the real possibility of the highest good defined as happiness exactly proportioned to morality. Perhaps the implicit quantification here is inappropriate. But still, if we are to believe ourselves accountable to the standard, we have to believe that it is the standard that is in fact operative. I cannot here get into theological questions about atonement and the relation of God's justice and God's mercy, and I have written about those elsewhere. My point is simply that if we believe that how things ought to be is sustained by how things actually are, over the whole span of creation. The commitment to morality will have implications about the final distribution of good and ill. Kant thinks immortality is, like the existence of God, a postulate of practical reason. His reason is that we do not seem to be finished in our progress towards holiness when we die. But we could add some thoughts from Marilyn Adams's excellent paper from the first conference, and also some thoughts from Steve Wykstra's excellent paper. If we participate in what she called horrendous evils, there is damage to our lives that justice would repair or defeat. And if we do not see this in this life, we can hope for it in the next. One way to see the results of this paper is that it connects with Steve Wykstra in the following way. Kant stresses the hiddenness of God within the theoretical use of reason. But he also stresses that we can, so to speak, get into God's mind, at least to the extent that we have what he calls a moral conception of God. And so we have what Steve calls, I quote from him, important access to sorts of goods that jointly both God passionately cares about and that God passionately wants us also to care about. These 3 points about God's 3 roles are just a beginning of what a transcendental response might look like, and all of them require more work. But I want to propose this as a fruitful and currently under-examined strategy for thinking about the problem of evil.
Well, thanks very much, John. In order to consider how moral theory might be better applied to God and the problem of evil, John discusses Immanuel Kant's fairly radical solution concerning how this might be done. I say it is a fairly radical solution because John points out Kant rejects every known attempt to deal with God and the problem of evil in favor of his own unique form of theodicy that moves from an understanding of morality to postulates of God and an afterlife, where happiness is in proportion to virtue. Now, if morality does in fact practically support these 2 postulates, we really have just the kind of useful contribution of moral theory to the problem of evil that in my Templeton project I was hoping was possible. So why haven't contemporary philosophers of religion simply jumped on the Kantian bandwagon here and adopted Kant's solution to the problem of evil instead of pursuing forms of theodicies and defenses quite similar to the ones John tells us Kant rejects? And why haven't I, too, jumped on the Kantian bandwagon, given that Kant's approach to the problem of evil makes moral theory the very vehicle for a solution? Speaking just for myself, I have trouble locating the Kantian postulates of God and an afterlife where happiness is in proportion to virtue in our common conception of morality, even though I see in our common conception of morality broadly Kantian features. Let's see then if I can put my finger on what bothers me about Kant's moral theodicy that John has laid out. To do this, let's focus on just one strand of our common conception of morality, our obligation to fight for our country in just causes. Now, I believe we have this obligation when certain conditions are satisfied. For example, peaceful means for resolving conflicts must have been exhausted, and the burden to fight for one's country must fall fairly on all those who are capable of doing the fighting. Thus, if most people in a country, say the U.S., who are capable of fighting, reject any such obligation, it will not be the case that you and I should go to our local armory, grab M1s, and go to our northern border to try and stop the hordes of Canadians who just happen to be invading our country. So our obligation to fight for our country does depend on what other members of our country are doing. But assuming that they are able and willing to fulfill the comparable demands that an obligation to fight for our country places on them, and assuming that other relevant conditions are met, then I think the obligation kicks in for me. And so I should be motivated to act on that obligation, although in my particular case, I think I might be entitled to some kind of an exemption. In any case, I don't see any reason to think that my justification or motivation for carrying out my obligation should depend in any way on Kant's postulates of God and an afterlife, where happiness is in proportion to virtue. Now, it's true that if I believe the postulates, I might have some additional motivation for fulfilling my obligation, because the postulates imply that if I carried out my obligation and I'm killed in the conflict, I will still be treated appropriately in the afterlife for fulfilling my obligation. But while such motivation may actually figure in some people's compliance with their moral obligations, it does seem to weaken and even undermine the moral motivation we have that's based on an understanding of a fair distribution of burdens in society, which should suffice, and in favorable conditions do suffice, to both justify and motivate right conduct. So my initial inclination is to simply reject Kant's moral theodicy in favor of other strands of Kantian moral theory that can be justified and motivated by reason alone. Obviously then, I need some more help from John here to see why I should accept Kant's moral theory-based solution to the problem of evil.
I don't know what the proper format is.
You can respond. You're free to respond.
Yes. Good, thank you. So there are 2 points I want to make in response. The first is to the idea that caring about my own happiness weakens or undermines moral motivation. I think Jim suggested that would be the case. And sometimes people who are Kantians about morality find Kant's thoughts about happiness in religion and at the end of the second critique troublesome for this reason. They think that I remember Fred Beiser saying there was a cancer that had to be removed from the Kantian body. Although he then later actually changed his mind about that. And it's interesting that he changed his mind. So I don't think there is this undermining effect. I think actually you can't have the parts of Kant you want without the parts of Kant that you don't want. And that's because the way Kant thinks about the moral law is that it is controlling our inclinations. So for God, who is holy, God is not under a law, because God doesn't have any potentially competing inclinations. So this picture, I think, in Kant is we have these inclinations, and it's good for us to have them, as we're that kind of creature, inclinations towards our own happiness, but we need the moral law to keep those in line. And we are this combination. And so what we're given as an end is something that satisfies both the moral law and our inclinations, and that's the chief good. So I don't think this detachment is going to work of these two parts of Kant. That's the first point. Second point is this, about just war. Kant has quite a lot to say about that, but I wasn't talking about that. And I wasn't really talking about Kant's normative theory at all. That is, I was talking about what Kant thinks we should think once we've established what our obligations are, not about what Kant thinks about how we establish what our obligations are. So once we have established what our obligations are by some procedure of moral reasoning, the question is, why should we then do it? Or why should I take the moral demand as a proper demand upon me? And Kant thinks that because we are this combination, any answer that's going to be stable in the long run has to take account of our desire for our own happiness as well as our desire to do our duty. We've got to find a way to keep those two together. Otherwise, morality is not going to be able to persevere in a rationally stable way. Not that you couldn't actually be moral. I mean, Kant thinks of Spinoza as an example. Maybe this is unfair to Spinoza, I don't know. But Kant thinks of Spinoza as somebody who didn't believe in God, but was famously a morally good person. Perfectly possible to do that. And we know, I think, a lot more people than Kant did like that. But Kant wants to hold that that combination of disbelief in God with attempting to lead a morally good life, he thinks that's rationally unstable for the reasons that I've been describing.
So, as I understand the format, let me just remind you of the schedule. We're going to have some time for questions. I'm supposed to initially seek questions from students and undergraduates, and then we'll carry on for a while. Then there's a reception you're all invited to afterwards right outside, and the next two lectures tomorrow will be in a different setting. So just to remind you again, there's a breakfast reception in the Bartle, and the first talk at 10, but the breakfast is already available at the Bartle Hall, 131 at 9 o'clock, so you can get up early Saturday for that. You're invited. You'll be very happy, I hope, for the breakfast. Now, questions for Professor Hare from the audience. Someone that's here. The youngest person in the crowd. Well, I'll choose the very back row first, and others are invited.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. So there was something that you said at the end about Kant's view of like why faith is so important, which went by sort of quickly, and I'm not sure if I got it. But the thought was something like if we had knowledge of God and God's purposes rather than faith, then we would adhere to the moral laws as a result of hope and fear rather than, the correct reverence for duty and whatever. I guess I'm wondering, does Kant say anything about, we have, like in the Bible, there are people who see big pillars of fire, and there are lots of philosophers who took themselves, Kant thinks incorrectly, but who took themselves to have demonstrative knowledge of God and God's attributes. There are mystics who thought that they had like direct experiences of God. So these people, Kant thinks they didn't really have knowledge of God, but at least some of them probably thought they did, and were trying to act as if they had knowledge. And it doesn't seem like they lost their free will or anything. Does he have anything to say about these people?
Yes, he does. He's very suspicious of what he sometimes calls fanaticism, or what he sometimes calls enthusiasm. So here's a kind of test case where he expresses his suspicion. Suppose you thought you were receiving a command from God to take your son, or only son, whom you love, up to the top of the mountain and kill him. Kant thinks, in such a case, you know you shouldn't kill your son, who's innocent. You don't know whether this is God's voice or not. So you should say to yourself, that's not God. And I think he's generally inclined to think that our duties are God's commands, but we work out what our duties are by some rational procedure. We then attribute them to God as the commander. But we don't go the other way around. He doesn't like people who start from some kind of religious experience, like the reception of a command, and then move from that to their duty. Now, if you were a Christian, what should you say about Kant on this matter? I think that's a long discussion. an important discussion. I don't know how much more. I should probably stop at that point. All right.
So it seems like several of Kant's responses to the theodicies that you went through basically were of the form, well, this explanation is possible, but we can't know that it's true. And at the beginning, I think that Kant kind of set the demands up for like what theodicy should do.
Yeah.
That it needs to show us like, okay, these are, we can prove that these things are not really counter-purposive. But you might think that's an unfair dialectical standard, that if the atheist is bringing the problem of evil to the theist, that just as if somebody brings an apparent counterexample to a philosophical theory or contrary data to a scientific theory, that it's enough to show that, well, look, there's ways that this can plausibly be accommodated within the theory. Like if somebody says, well, the human eye shows that evolution is false, and you say, well, look, we can tell some story that, like, I can't prove that that's how it happened, but that this fits plausibly within the framework. What do you think Kant would say to somebody who said, well, the theist can just do the same kind of thing here with these theodicies that he's critical of?
Yeah, I mean, actually, he does say that. I mean, that is in effect his own theodicy. That is, he thinks that God's moral wisdom, he has faith that this moral wisdom of God permits this thing to happen, even though he can't tell you why. So that even though the justification is inscrutable. But that's within practical reason. I suppose your answer is, your question is, couldn't he say the same sort of thing about theodicy within theoretical reason? And that's a good question. Yeah, I suppose he thinks not. But that's because of his particular constraints on knowledge, which are not, I think, indisputable. I mean, we could disagree with him about what kind of thing knowledge is. If we agree with Kant about what kind of thing knowledge is, then we can't think that we have even a slight sense of what it is that's in God, a slight intuition. Because we don't have that kind of intuition, we don't have intellectual intuition, only God has that. And knowledge requires intuition of some kind. So we can't have even a preliminary answer from within speculative reason, but that's because of the limits on knowledge. And if you disputed those, then I think you should dispute those limits as well. Question?
Yeah, thank you. So, really in the talk, you distinguish two different types of theodicy that Kant was considering. One was philosophical, and had more to do with reason, speculative, that sort of thing. The second one I didn't catch a name for, but it's the one he favors, the one based on faith. And I was wondering if there might be another approach that has sort of a tradition, and whether or not Kant considered it, or whether or not he could have. And that's just the approach of sort of coming at questions central to theodicy by a narrative. So Milton would be, I guess, a good historical example of this. Maybe even Job, just as a narrative itself. It seems to me like you might think that you could gain some sort of knowledge or understanding by a narrative that would bear on these questions of theodicy, and yet wouldn't have to be objectionable in the philosophical or speculative ways that Kant seemed to be addressing in the text that you were analyzing. So I was just wondering if he had any thoughts on that, or if you think we could extrapolate of his ideas to sort of address
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I don't think of narrative here as being, as it were, coordinate with the other two. So it's not as though narrative is a third kind of use of reason. You could have a narrative that was within the practical use of reason, and I think in Job we've got something like that. So we're being given reasons within a story for why God should, as a morally wise agent, act in a certain way. But whether you put it in the form of a story or not isn't a question about whether this is practical or speculative reason. We could have stories, I suppose, within speculative use too, though they might be rather boring. But I don't think narrative is a third option coordinate with the other two.
If I understood your transcendental theodicy correctly, you were suggesting that we can get assurance that God has a reason, but we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And so I take it that the prima facie evidence we've got that God isn't good or powerful because of the existence of evil is overridden by some other argument. So you suggested that about the three kinds of authority that God has.
Yeah.
I take it that the practical argument, if we can see the practical argument that we're under the moral law, so we need to take our duties as God's command, maybe we can concede that God has the legal authority over us. But how do we get the other claims about God's goodness and in governing the universe? How do you connect? I see the argument only generating a part of what you need, not the whole of it. So maybe we can concede that God is the legislator, but how do we know that God is a just judge or a benevolent executor?
Yeah. Well, so the moral argument that I didn't actually describe in any detail is that morality itself gives us, as an end, the highest good, which is happiness in proportion to virtue. And that requires a divine executive and a divine judge to carry it out. So you couldn't actually have a moral law that was binding on us in a rationally stable way if you didn't have the divine executive and the divine judge. So the moral argument is supposed to give you the three as a package.
Quote from page 17, which we say, the central idea is that if we accept that we are under the moral law and that God gives us this law, then we have to believe also that the creation is the kind of place in which the attempt to live by the moral law makes sense.
Yes.
So I was understanding this question as kind of saying, maybe that sentence could be rewritten so it goes, the central idea is that we're under the moral law and we believe the world is the kind of place in which living by the moral law may make sense. And then we say, well, if we believe that, then we postulate that God is executive, judge, and legislator, or you don't look at it that way?
Yeah, I think that would be all right. I think that unpacks the logical structure of the second half of that sentence. I think that's correct. However, you illuminated something by sorting it out in that way. I think somebody who wants to object to this whole picture can object right here, can say, why should I think the moral life makes sense? Maybe this world is absurd, and I should live by the moral law anyway. And there are, I think that's what can be thought about Sisyphus. That he was given this command to roll the rock up the mountain, and then just roll down to the bottom again. Again and again. It didn't make any sense, but he still had to do it. And he shook his fist at the gods who gave him that task. So I think you've illuminated that by pointing to the necessity for my argument of the premise that this is the sort of world in which the moral life makes sense. And if you want to, that's a weak point. I mean, that's a point where I'm not sure it's a weak point. It's a point where the opponent should attack. I agree with Kant here. I think that this was my attempt at the thought experiment of the demon. I think if this world were absurd in that sort of way, so that whenever we tried to do good, we ended up doing more harm than good most of the time. If it was absurd in that sort of way, we wouldn't actually persevere in the moral life, and that's because we actually would care about the good.
There's a question back, but I want to follow up on it.
Yeah.
There's one argument that I thought possibly was a bad argument, but maybe something else going on. So you remember the line about the games that you're talking about, the absurd? He says about suicide and decline,
yes.
To play the game of life once more.
Yes.
So that certainly is a bad argument.
Yes.
Because at first reading,
yes.
First casual reading, because there's a difference between saying you don't want to do it again,
Yeah.
and saying I wish I'd never done it at all. Or there's lots, for example, well, I might say childbirth, or some might say graduate school. You really want to do it again,
Yeah.
but if I never had the chance, and I'm glad I had a chance, whatever.
Yeah.
Once. But I think so. I think he must have been saying something else himself. And he uses this word "game" a lot. And he uses the word "game" as his canoe move, where he kind of says, "Some of you people like Schiller, you think it's just a game, and that's just so bloody awful. There has to be a moral point to this." So I think he kind of got off track on that because he's talking about people worrying about pleasure and pain and so forth. And I think he's really got the moral. My hypothesis is that he's really got the moral meaning of life in eye there, though it doesn't fit that argument exactly because he's just talking about pleasures and so forth. But if things are so askew that would be what you were worrying about, then you would say, that's really, I don't really thought that. I don't know, just a hypothesis. You agree that argument's a little strange.
I agree with you. It's not a good argument as it stands, and that's a good hypothesis for how he got there.
It's like Kant, the Odyssey.
I need to look though. I need to look back again at the text and see. Sorry.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if this is allowed, but I'm going to re-ask my first question because I think I didn't articulate it.
Oh, okay.
So this is my worry.
Yeah.
Kant's account of why faith is important seems like it rests on a certain thesis about psychological motivation, right? If we had knowledge of God, we would be robbed of our ability to act on the correct, follow the moral law for the correct reasons, right? It seems like if knowledge of God would rob us of that ability, then thinking that you had knowledge of God, even incorrectly, would also rob you of that ability.
Yeah.
But lots of people have thought that they had knowledge of God, and it doesn't seem like these people are just fearfully always doing what they think. These people seem like they face the same sorts of temptations we do. And so it seems like Kant's thesis about the importance of faith rests on a thesis about psychological motivation, which is empirically falsified. And so I'm wondering if he tries to address that at all.
Okay, good. Yeah, I see. Well, so he does talk about people, the so-called elect. Have to remember that he grew up within Pietist Lutheranism, went to a Pietist Lutheran school, in which they had to declare their faith publicly all the time. And he, at the end of religion, compares unfavorably the so-called elect, who think they have this knowledge of God, with the ordinary person, the ordinary citizen, who does his duty because it's his duty. I think Kant thinks that that kind of knowledge is corrupting. That it gives people a kind of either too much security or, on the other hand, too much fear. And it's corrupting of the moral motivation itself. So it is, you're right, a psychological thesis, but I think it's one that he would endorse.
Jim? Yeah, let me go to the issue of we need morality to make sense. And that's the goal here, the neutral goal between communists and homies. Now, the example I gave of fighting for one's country, I'm trying to indicate under what conditions that would make sense, that you have that obligation. And you could raise, as you did, this issue about morality versus self-interest. And it was looking like morality puts certain demands on us, self-interest, other demands, and Kant's postulates sort of bring that together. But there's another way to think about it. That is that morality itself takes self-interest and the interests of others into account and molds them together in some defensible way. And so it's not like we need now a hypothesis, a postulate to get self-interest back in. It's already there. How much can, I have my interest in myself, but there's the interest of others, and what's a fair, what's a reasonable way of dealing with these two, and if I can be convinced this is fair, and then I can move forward, and I don't need a further hypothesis about my interest being taken into account.
Good. I know that's your view. I suppose the first thing I want to say is it's not Kant. And so I was sort of responding that you can't have the good part of Kant that you want without the part of Kant that you don't want. So you haven't actually got a part of Kant in here when you say this. Because I think Kant wants to say that there are real cases in which morality and what I perceive to be my interest conflict. And in those cases, I have to choose. I have to rank. And there are two basic ways to rank, he thinks, one of which he says is under the good maxim and one of which is under the evil maxim. And they both have both. But the good maxim ranks duty over happiness, and the evil maxim ranks happiness over duty. And you've got to be under one or the other.
What about a maxim of following what reason requires? And sometimes reason requires the interests of others take top billing, and sometimes reason requires the interests of self take top billing.
I think that Kant thinks there's no neutral account of reason. And you might disagree with him here, but there's no neutral account of reason that can give you both. There is an account of prudential rationality, which will give you the cases where you should follow your own. And there's a case of there's the case of moral rationality, which means that you have to be blind about whether it's you or somebody else. It's what sort of Rawlsian kind of Weyliner, that's what he's trying to get at. What you're proposing is a third alternative, which is
there's a neutral reason standpoint that is somehow fair or non-question-making to these two others, and then makes a determination.
And I think if you could pull that off, then you wouldn't need the postulate. So I think that's what you already did.
Well, you're helping me.
But I don't think you could pull it off. So that's the difference between us. Steve?
Karl, there's a younger guy over there. I think he's younger than me with the burgundy shirt on.
Are you sure he's younger?
Yeah, you're younger. Yeah.
I hope to make it clear how much younger I am. Thanks for being here. By the lack of clarity question. Maybe just repeat, but maybe flip it, just say, why wouldn't we just say that morality is part of every person's self-interest? Having a more capacious understanding of what self-interest includes.
Yeah.
In the kind of situations where you're saying the perceived my interest would be more specifically something like my life is at stake versus the flourishing of this community, my family, my country, this, that, or the other.
Yeah.
In which case, they both are part of my self-interest and drawn on the following principle, or just the Aquinas, don't do evil. I'm just governed by the idea that what I do is I choose a good. I don't choose to violate either one. So I'm not doing any harm.
Yeah.
I'm not causing any harm.
Yeah.
And I skim between the two monsters, and I do good as part of my self-interest.
So I think you can believe in that if you can believe in what Kant calls this glorious moral melody, in which there's a natural harmony. And what is best for me naturally harmonizes with what's best for my community, which naturally harmonizes with what's best for the whole ecological order, which is what harmonizes with God's wishes. If there's this natural harmony all the way through, then I'm not going to have the kinds of tensions that make the postulates necessary. But I think that Kant thinks, I think he's right, that there isn't this natural harmony, and that what we have is sort of tragedy all the way through. So that theologically, it's because of the fall, but you don't have to put this theologically. My good and the good of my community can diverge. So the example I give of this is that I worked for some years in Congress on the staff of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And what I observed was even the good members of Congress, and they're not all good, had to sacrifice their virtue for the sake of the public good. This is what's called the problem of dirty hands. I think there is not that community of interest, or that natural harmony. And with respect to us and the ecological order, I think the interests of the inhabitants of Washington, D.C. do not naturally harmonize with the good of all the other species in that geographical area. Alas, we species compete, and we flourish only when other species do not. So an invasive plant species comes in and it wipes out the species that are already there. So, and then even with respect to the friends of God, and here we get into theological can of worms, but for Aquinas, God can create some vessel for destruction. So there's what theologically is called reprobation. And what that means is, if you want God to have everything good, that might not include the union of God and the union. And there's another tension. So tragedy all the way down. Well, how I see it, but it's not how you see it.
I don't know.
Would you allow historical complication on that? As a younger person, Kant didn't think there was so much tragedy. Because had the earlier teleological pictures,
yeah,
and then he read this French guy, and reminded of getting old and things being difficult. So
yeah,
this is there are different views of this in different times. And you go on,
it gets darker,
deeper and darker view.
I think so. There's some wonderful purple passages in the third critique about the abyss. So you're right, I think. And I think Kant is not alone in that our perception of the dark increases as we get older. Maybe that's not your
Yeah. I was curious, you mentioned several times the happiness in proportion to virtue being the highest good.
Yeah.
And this being sort of an afterlife thing, as I take it. Would that include direct knowledge of God? And if so, how could we be virtuous in the afterlife with knowledge of God in a way that comes down?
Yeah. Here's a place where I depart from Kant. Kant thinks about the afterlife as getting morally better and better and better. We never actually get to holiness of the will, but we sort of approximate it more and more closely forever. But to me, that's a very unappealing picture. I mean, not that I don't want to get morally better, I do, but I think that there's more involved in the next life than just getting morally better. In the tradition, we have pictures of beatific vision or union or fruition. Kant is just completely blind to all of that, or at least not blind to it, it's just he doesn't like it. And he doesn't like it, I think, it's purely psychological speculation. But I think he had a surfeit of it when he was young. He turned against it.
A surfeit of what?
Surfeit well, so I'll say piety, but piety can be a good thing, and what he had a surfeit of wasn't a good thing. It was so at the school that he went to, the students had to publicly confess their sins once a month. Just a bad idea. And what it created, Kant thought, was insincerity.
Used to do that in religious orders.
Yeah. Slightly different, though, than with school children.
Right. We were shown.
Right.
Stu, we're going to follow up?
Yeah, I have a question. Is it okay? I don't know if the thoughts I have listening to this discussion and some of the things you say are at all on track with the way Kant is thinking or you're thinking. And they're kind of loose, but I guess there's two thoughts I'm having, and I want to just try them out and see if they're on track or what you make of them. So one thought or question is, so how does this relate to the types of problem of evil that we're engaged with today? And I liked, who's the guy in the kind of orange shirt right there? Yeah. Neil, yeah. So one tack might be that you could think that thinking more of evidential problems of evil, that the types of suffering we see in the world do sort of count against the existence of God, and that what we're looking for is ways to, by, I guess, kind of appeal to practical reason rather than evidential reason, which would be a type of speculative reason. We're trying to put some reasons to believe in the other side of the balance, with a different sort of reason. And then the question is, well, what sort of reason are those, and how do they get their grip? And there a story just is coming back to me that I'd forgotten, something that happened to me when I was 30 or so, and I was at Oxford for one term. And I told this to some of the colleagues earlier over lunch, but I went to see Michael Dummett in his office or room, and I asked him, because I was kind of schizoid about it at the time, what's your best reason for believing in God? And he smoked his pipe for about 5 minutes and thought, and he said, are you asking me what I think the best reason is, or what reason of mine for believing is the best? And I said, well, the second. Then he thought for another 5 minutes, just total silence. And he said, I think if I were not to believe, I would be betraying a certain ideal of holiness. And because I was young and impressionable and he gave it such thought, no, because it was a weighty answer. I really respected it, and I just thanked him for it. I didn't have any questions about it. I thanked him. So how do reasons get their grip on us? And it seems to me that I took him to mean, I don't know if this is what he did mean, but the holiness, it could come in different ways, but sometimes we meet people who have a kind of sanctity that's not like this oppressive kind that you talked about, but they have a kind of sanctity that you just are drawn to so much. And when in the 60s, there were these Christian singers. I remember one, Linda Rich, she had, I want to be like the man of Galilee. It's just this little song. You know that?
Yeah, no. Of course I do.
Yeah. So we get this, when we talk about moral duty, the talk of it kind of falls short of this appeal, the grip of this ideal of holiness. And I remember R.C. Sproul once said, if I didn't believe in God, I'd just descend to the flesh pots of Paris. And I'm a lot like him. I would just, even though I know like a libertine life is folly, I'd just go for it. The appeal to live out, try to live out this ideal of holiness just doesn't make any sense apart from belief in God. I don't know if that's at all what Kant had in mind, but when he compares, what's that famous quote about the starry heavens above and the moral law within?
Neil said I should say this.
It's starry heavens.
Here's the starry heavens.
So yeah, give us the full quote. Give us the full quote, because I want it to be something, two things.
The moral law within and the starry heavens above.
And they both do something to us.
Fill me with awe.
Fill me with awe.
And reverence, maybe. What do you think? I think that's
Something like that.
Yeah.
So he flip-flops them, but it's a very valid passage. So it's got the sense of it's both the external and internal carefully.
Yeah, but those seem very different than just a sense of duty. I shouldn't cheat. I have a duty not to cheat on this, law exam. That context that I'm reminded of by Dummett and Linda Rich songs is a very different one.
Yeah.
And it's kind of pious, but it's part of what does weigh in the balance.
Yeah.
Actually, when we are struggling with these problems.
Yeah. So I think that's a Kantian way of thinking about it. So duty, our term now, is impoverished. We think of duty as always telling us to do what we don't want to do. But Kant's ideal is where we do it gladly. He's against what he calls a morose ethics, even though that's how he's standardly interpreted. So it is something like holiness. Holiness is his word for what God is like. We never quite have that. But But what you're giving us is the priority of the practical. It's a life of a certain kind that we deeply admire, and where we feel the force of that. That's what Kant would call the fact of reason. You know, we recognize that, and that's our starting point. And from that we get the postulates. I think you've given us a very good, a richer picture of what Kant was trying to do.
Can I stick to this comment?
Oh, yeah, you
While we're bringing that. And how do the practical and the theoretical reasons, how do you adjudicate them? If you've got straightforward illustrations that God doesn't seem to govern justly, and yet practical reason demands that you think that God does, why is the practical trumping?
So it only trumps if theoretical reason has failed to find a veto. So it's not that you can believe whatever you want to believe. But he thinks that because of the limits of human reason, this is why he spends all of those 800 pages on the limits. We don't know that there isn't a reason why God allows it. If we did, then we couldn't believe that there was, after all, a reason. That would be, I guess, we would lose our integrity. But because of the limits, we don't know that. And so there is no veto. And so the moral argument prevails.
Yes, hi. Thanks so much for that presentation. That was really fascinating, both from the point of view of Kant's interpretation, but also possible theodicies and the like. That was great kind of overview in a way. I thought that I wanted to make something like Steve's point, but now I don't know if my point is yours or if it isn't, or if it's Kant or it's not Kant. Well, I don't think it's Kant. In other words, I want to object to Kant, and I don't know, was that what you were saying? Or no? Okay. I want to object that along the lines that duty, just acting out of duty, isn't really the ideal of the moral life. Maybe it's something like holiness, but I think I want to try a different word. Maybe it's something like love, like a kind of perfection of love. To be very concerned about other people and their well-being and so forth, to have the right attitudes toward them. So that Job, in the Job story, even though it doesn't work very well as a soul-making, I don't like the soul-making theodicy particularly. It seems like a sort of joke, or practical joke or something. If God already knows how virtuous you are, then you sort of throw out some things to prove it or something like that. Sometimes it's presented that way anyway. I don't know if it perfects Job in virtue anyway to suffer, because he already is an upright man. Right? God says to Satan there, behold how upright. So maybe he does act out of duty for the sake of duty and so forth. But I don't think holiness is to do that, no matter how rational you got, how impressed you were with the moral law, that you were just thrilled to be able to conform your actions to that and so forth. I don't think it's enough. So I thought the temptation for Job was not so much that he would stop obeying the commandments of God, but it was a test of his love. I mean, Satan asked, why does he obey you? Isn't it just because, after all, you give him all these nice things? Why shouldn't he continue to observe the commandments and so forth? They're probably not all that hard for him. Maybe he's not sinless, but I mean, he mostly does what he's supposed to do. He follows his duty. And he is tempted then by this experience, not to necessarily give up on virtue, but to give up on the love of God. I mean, to think that God is unjust, but also that why would one love a person who would permit this and so forth? He doesn't have a reason, but it's difficult. So that's what he's being tested on, and the alternatives are, I guess, to think you deserve it, which he doesn't. He sort of knows he doesn't. Or to just give up, I mean, curse God and die. Well, the not cursing God and not just not cursing God, but continuing to love God, to trust God, to believe in the absolute goodness and mercy and God's love for you and so on. I thought that was the hard part for him.
Yeah.
So that's the ideal to me of the moral life, not just this kind of seeing what your duties are and then trying to match yourself to them in this kind of heroic way, I guess, ignoring anything else.
Well, I think in the end I'm going to agree with you.
Yes.
Kant has a little bit more to say, though, before I do that. What he's interested in as the ideal is what he calls practical love.
Okay.
And by practical love, he means to make a distinction from what he calls, and a slightly unfortunate current language, pathological love. The pathological love is a love merely of feeling.
Right, right. Okay.
And he doesn't want love that's merely, because this is a kind of love that's commanded.
Right, well, yes, and I mean, right. But it's a real love.
It's practical love.
Right. I'll take that.
So you shouldn't, because, I mean, you shouldn't take, it's too easy.
Well, probably.
Because even though he says that, he actually, I think, has an impoverished view of our affective nature.
Well, desert too.
I think he needs to be corrected on this, and that not all of our inclinations are self-directed in the way that he thinks that they are, and so there is, I think, a problem in Kant here that you're pointing to, but he does at least say it's practical love.
Yeah, well, it's a good start.
Okay, time for one last question, and then we'll have a reception.
Okay. I was just going to ask, because about what we were just talking about with about theoretical reasoning, that if there's no veto from theoretical reasoning, the practical reasoning wins.
Yeah.
That it seems a little odd to me because it seems to not. I'm probably just missing the main point, but it seems like it doesn't leave room for the kind of certitude that we would want if we're saying that, and maybe this isn't what was being said, but that like the practical reason we say that we know these things, but only because we haven't disproved them. But that is he leaving open the possibility that it could be disproven? That like that theoretical reason veto could come about? Or is he just saying that that couldn't happen?
Well, so no, I don't think he's saying it couldn't happen. He's saying that it hasn't happened. But he doesn't, he at least in words, he's modest about the future. I mean, it could be, I say at least in words, I mean, Karl was here and he knows Kant much better than I do, but I think he thought he'd pretty much got it. But anyway, it's not, we don't just believe because there's the absence of veto. We believe for justifying reasons, especially the fact of reason, that we recognize this moral law, this holiness. And then we trace out the presuppositions of that, transcendentally, what has to be the case, if that's going to be the case. And so we end up not with knowledge in his narrow sense, but with justified true belief.
That's a good note. So thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you.